In section 1D, we're going to look at factoring by grouping. And we're going to do a lot of this even as we get to trinomial factoring. Factoring by grouping always happens when you have four terms. So let's go ahead and put that in your notes. You're going to kind of group the first two terms together, and then you're going to kind of group the last two terms and factor a common factor out of those. And then we'll look at what's left and factor, and typically this will factor then into two binomials multiplied together. So let's look at number 28, the first one here. Okay, notice I've got four terms there, 5n to the third plus 10n squared plus 3n plus 6. So what we're going to do is we're going to group, we can't factor anything out of all those terms, there's nothing in common of all those terms, but if we do some grouping here, we can factor out a common factor from two terms. So we're going to group 5n cubed and 10n squared together with parentheses. And then we're going to group our last two terms together. Now you really got to be careful if that third term there, in this case the 3n was negative. This example doesn't get into that. But we're going to group, it's a positive, so we're going to leave that positive out front. We're going to group 3n plus 6 together. Now, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger here so we can see. Now, if you look at the first two terms I grouped together, we want to think we just did factoring out a greatest common factor, and that's what we're going to do from this 5n cubed and 10n squared here. If we think about the greatest common factor, well, 5 goes into both 5 and 10, and we can also take out n squared. So we're going to take and we're going to put 5n squared out in front of parentheses because that's my greatest common factor of those two terms. Okay? And then we're going to figure out what we have left, just like we did in the prior section, section C. Well, if I take 5n squared out of the 5n cubed, I'm left with n to the first power, because 5n squared times n will give me 5n cubed. And if I take 5n squared out of the plus 10n squared, okay, I'm going to be left with plus 2. So I have 5n squared times n plus 2. Now, we're going to continue on here, and we're going to look at this second group of terms here. And I can factor a common factor out of those as well. I can take a 3 out. Can't take a variable out because there's no variable on the 6. But so what we're going to do is we're going to take out a positive 3, and we're going to figure out what's left. Now, if I take 3 out of 3n, 3 times what is 3n? Well, that'll be n. And if I take 3 out of 6, or in other words, I take the 6 and I divide by the 3, or 3 times what is equal to 6, that's going to be plus 2. Now, you're always going to find an interesting thing happen here with factoring by grouping. And what I want you to notice is when we factored by grouping, kind of think of this as two halves here. You've got, what we factored out of those first two terms. We got the 5n squared in front of the n plus 2. And the second half is kind of that plus 3 in front of the n plus 2. Notice, this always happens when you factor by grouping. You get the same binomial left in each. Okay, then at the end, what's going to happen is you're going to have two binomials multiplied together. One of them is going to be that common one of n plus 2. So it's like I'm taking that out. I'm taking out this n plus 2 and this n plus 2 from each of the halves. Well, if I take that out and take that out, if I take it out of the first part, I'm left with 5n squared. So now in my second binomial, I'm going to be left with 5n squared. And if I take the n plus 2 out of this last part here, I'm left with plus 3. So basically what you need to remember is it's always going to be two binomials multiplied together at the end when you factor by grouping. What goes in one is the common thing, in this case the n plus 2. That's common, that's in the parentheses. And basically what goes in the second set of parentheses is always what you have outside of parentheses. You see how you have the 5n squared plus 3. So when you factor this by grouping, it's these two binomials multiplied together. Now, if you actually multiplied those back together, FOILed them, whatever you want to call it, you would get to your original terms.